Right. Good evening. It's interesting to think that it's just over 100 years since Lowther started digging at Ashtead. Um, Although he himself insisted he started in 1926, which I still haven't been able to explain. But we'll come back to that perhaps later on. Right, now let's just see if I can make this thing move. No, okay. That will do the job. David, when he asked me to do this, reminded me that some people, it's been so long since we've ended the dig, some people may not have seen any talks by me and may not know too much about the background. So I'll do a quick amount of background, um, starting with the obvious and explaining where we are, um, which is obviously close to you here in what is central Surrey in terms of the historic county at least. One of the things I should have said there, of course, is that it's not very far from Stane Street, as you can see. And there is supposedly at least an access road from Stane Street, which leads to the site in the Roman period, that is. Right. Couple of other things I ought to say before I forget. One is I'll try not to take too long, but I do apologize if I seem to go on forever. The second is to say that quite a lot of this, at least in places, is speculative, and keep trying to put this talk together. I came up with some fresh ideas that I hadn't anticipated. You do that when you're trying to put the slides together and so on. So bear in mind that I may have changed my mind again by the time it actually gets around to publication, though I very much hope that this year will see at least the creation of a final report. Right. We really start back in 1924 when Lowther there started doing a survey on Ashtead Common and, among other things, started rooting around when he found a tile, Roman tile, which led in due course to him hacking out a certain amount of more tiles and some Roman walls and so on. And then the thing turned into a dig with the aid of this man, Arthur Cotton, who had soon after that become the lord of the manor of Ashtead, and therefore the person who could give permission for it to go ahead. One thing I would draw your attention to is this is the Daily Sketch in 1925. So even Lowther's press cuttings told him it started before he claimed it did in 1926, but never mind. He, in due course, with Cotton and others, came up with this plan of a Roman villa, which, as you can see at the top, J.T. Smith, who studied lots of villas, said that Ashtead remained a unique plan. And it's worth saying that we haven't been able to change that plan much, at least in the final period. So the first of the various things that are unique about Ashtead is that. He also found a separate bathhouse here, and you can see the relationship over there. About 40 years later, in the 1960s, John Hampton, who lived locally and was then working for the Ordnance Survey, did a certain amount of excavation himself, and he found evidence for an enclosure wall. You can see it here, and various other bits and pieces of evidence. That's John in his 90th year, I think, there. And one of the things he did that was very useful to us was a very detailed survey of the site. You can see where Lowther's villa and bathhouse were. He plotted those in, but he also plotted in the main clay pit and other earthworks around. He found his enclosure wall, and these things proved really, really useful to us when we were initially starting, because the whole area is heavily overgrown. And this is us. One of the things David forgot to mention in the introduction was it wasn't only sometimes cold and variously miserable, but it was also often wet. And this is the first time I'd seen a trench, an archaeological trench, which was completely underwater. So that was an interesting experience as well. It did make life quite difficult. It's worth pointing out, I should have mentioned, that the site is on London clay and it means it. So we ended up with a known triangular earthwork, which I'll come back to. There's Lowther's Villa and Bathhouse. We added a new building, which we tend to refer to as a proto-villa. John's enclosure wall. There's the clay pit. We found kilns, two kilns, one after the other on the same site. And John had added quite a lot of other stuff about the tile works. The sources of information are actually quite difficult for this site. When I started the project, I rather naively thought that Lowther's 3 reports would be accompanied by all the finds in Guildford Museum and various old notes of his. In fact, there are very few old notes of his, and the reports are internally inconsistent. And sometimes the newspaper reports actually produce more information than was in the published reports, which is slightly worrying. There's lots of contemporary photographs, though they're usually unlabeled. There are also draft texts of Lowther's, a whole lot of other stuff. Lowther reassessed the site in 1959. He also wrote a considerable number of other site reports of his work in Surrey, which sometimes refer back to Ashtead and actually give information that isn't in the Ashtead reports. And his work on relief pattern tiles and on lamp chimneys and things like that led him to do a lot more work. And again, there are references in that back to what was going on at Ashtead. John Hampton passed me his dig records, and we do have all the various finds from our own dig and from the other digs. We've got John Hampton's finds. Lowther's and Cotton's finds got distributed all over the place. Many of them were still in his house when he died, and they were rescued by the Leatherhead Society, but they weren't properly labelled, and so there's always a degree of confusion about what actually comes from Ashtead. I mentioned that Lowther did did research on the patterns on flue tiles, which formed the basis of the recent to me, it's 1997, I think, corpus of relief pattern tiles, which is still a standard work. So where do we start with on the site? We have the triangular earthwork. When we started, no one knew what date it was. And Lowther had suggested, in fact, that he wondered if it was pre-Roman and suggested a section, and we did one. And lo and behold, very unexpectedly for me at least, I didn't expect to get any finds from the ditch. We came up with some great big lumps of pottery, which can be dated to around the period of the Roman conquest, around about AD 43. So that was a game. Further work on that produced evidence which suggested that there were 3 phases of ditches on that area at least. And this had been prefigured by Dave McComish and people who work with him from English Heritage, who did a detailed survey. They thought it was multi-phase. So we're probably looking at least 2 periods of prehistoric use. And certainly there was activity there in the Roman period as well. Late Iron Age we can be sure about because we have late Iron Age pottery. There's a hint on the magnetometry of perhaps some roundhouses or whatever. There was certainly Iron Age pottery from inside the ditch. And later on, when a little bit of work was done in connection with an illegal metal detecting find. But there was also prehistoric material from the proto-villa and Lowther's villa site. And Lowther himself said there was stuff down by the nearby stream, the Rye. So there's been prehistoric activity on this site of scattered and definitely something going on. And we still really need to consider what the earthwork was actually for, whether it was permanently occupied or as a refuge or what. If we go on, once the Romans turn up, as it were, in the 1840s, Lowther himself noticed that there was a chalk deposit, Brie Villa, in this area here, in front of the villa. So far as I can remember, he doesn't mention it at all, really, in the report. He doesn't speculate on what it's about, but he did know there was something there. And we found it at the front in this area. That's this trench, trench 8, a bit more there. But more importantly, we found that it went beyond the end of the villa, out this way. That's the villa outer wall, and there's still chalk building going on out there. It's a chalk floor building with beam slots. And that has to be the earliest building, Roman period building on the site. And as such, it may be paralleled, for example, at an early Roman villa at Park Street, St. Albans, where you can see there's a chalk floor again.
No, you always press the wrong one. It's the bit,
Yeah.
Sorry? Oh, okay. The chalk floor buildings here were said to be Belgic, by which we can understand to mean around the period of the Roman conquest. If we move on, it is quite likely that there was activity on the proto-villa site in the pre-Roman period, right at the very late Iron Age, or into the very beginning of the Roman period. But very soon they built that building there. If we move on a bit, this centre of core, with probably some sorts of internal divisions as well. There it is, turn sideways. This is Emma's sketch. And I've put this on. This is the Ditches Roman Villa out near Cirencester. And you can see that there's a certain similarity about the way these things are constructed. This is an early villa, again, in the 70s. And what's interesting is that it's associated with an earthwork, just like Ashtead is, except that in that case, the building's outside the earthwork, but nearby. Here's a few other examples. Gorhamber is a particularly nice one, with its late Iron Age enclosure and the villa one end. And for those who believe in isolated bathhouses, no, they're not. There's an isolated bathhouse. It's there because it's associated with a Roman villa. They're just not next to one another. We've got a possible other example of our own in Chiddingfold, where the Grahams found this Iron Age enclosure. And you can see that there's a little unusual little early villa in an offshoot of that. So probably something of the same sort is going on. There's some interesting research to be done on this sort of thing. Again, very early, likely to be very early in the period, the Roman period. We have this reference to what must be Roman Republican silver coins. A good reference by Paget in the sense that you can see he actually notes that he hadn't seen them, but records what he has been able to find out. And Richard Rees agrees that this sounds like a perfectly good Roman Republican coin. And they tend to have early military associations. At least that's the way people tend to think about them at the moment. Also probably early is this deposit that was found by illegal metal detecting on the earthwork site. A couple of bronze vessels. They're not easy to reconstruct, but they're thought to be early Roman. And there are parallels for that sort of thing on prehistoric sites of some significance, where there's a deliberate ritual deposit of some kind. And that, I think, is the most likely explanation of these things. They're honouring the old site. Where are we? We're in the early period. We can move over to the villa. There's the proto-villa. One of the things I'd forgot to mention was its apparent entrance on this side, which appears to be facing back towards the earthwork. So it's odd to find an entrance that isn't facing south or east. And this one was well marked. I'm not sure if I've got a later version of it. I'll come back to that. Lowther himself thought that there was some sort of activity very early on underneath the villa. He did a few sondages, and you can see on his labels here, which were probably done for exhibitions, that even quite early on, he was changing the date of his own excavation. You can see there, for example, that it used to say 1925, and he's changed it to 26, and in this one too. It's really quite odd, and I can't explain it. The villa site itself produces, as well as that early pottery, which could well be as early as Lowther thought, has early Samian, some of it pre-Flavian, or possibly so. One of the pieces in particular, a rather fine early form of what would become a Dragendorf 30, but in this case isn't, to Hermé 4. So enough to suggest a lot of activity, most of it in the area of the villa in that sort of location. And that suggests it's associated with the immediate successor of the chalk floor building, which ran across here, because these foundations cut it, or at least not that one, but the one over here. Cut that early building. It's gone out of use already, but they must be related pretty much to the earliest building on the site. And the most interesting thing about them is this double apse effect here and here, which is likely to be associated with the bathhouse. Now you can also see three little stub walls coming off the front here with the apses beyond them. And when we were digging the site, we noticed an awful lot of black material in this sort of area, so possibly associated with a furnace. We found bits of opus signinum which seemed to have been shaped, and we speculated might have come from the bathhouse known to exist at the other side of the villa. And Lowther noticed this big lump of Paludina limestone, which you can see is marked as 3B, by which he means the 3B, by which he means the porch of the late villa, although he thought it was earlier, I think. And this sort of thing might well have come from baths lining. In fact, we've got another slab of it from the probable baths area at the Abinger villa. But he also thought it came from the baths the other side, but it's much more likely, in fact, that it came from a very early baths on this site. And just to show you the sort of thing I'm thinking about, this is the Heirloom baths, and you can see there's the furnace cheeks, there's the double apse. And there at that site, they've got a circular laconicum, which is off the main building. This is later and it's bigger. It's a town, not a villa site, but it shows you the sort of thing we might be looking at. There are other things that show stuff is happening earlier in some parts of the villa than later. What we've got in the villa is a late plan, Lowther's plan, but some of the rooms are some of the walls are definitely earlier than some of the others. So this was a very good example in Trench 4, which is that staggered junction. We wondered what that was. We wondered if it was right. And you can see that it was right. Lowther got it right there. That wall is much better built and in a different system to the later walls which adjoin it, this one and this one. So however you view it, room 10 and room 13 are later than, and room 12 are later than room 11. How you explain that, of course, is a matter of choice, really. We also found that if we move to the other side of the villa, this is room 6, which I'll come back to in a moment, that the join between room 6 and room 4, we're outside looking that way, is quite different. That in fact, room 6 was there first and room 4 joined it later. But it's still rather nicely built in this part of its structure. Whoops, sorry. So room 6 potentially could be freestanding, or at least partially freestanding at this period. It is a very, oh, sorry, and I've also got the one of the 3 probable foundation urns that Lowther and co found, but it's difficult to date it well enough to be sure what date room 1 was. Room 1 is a bit of a puzzle to me, and I can't really explain it satisfactorily. Lowther always said that the foundation urn, so-called, was actually built into the wall, and later probably in the 1950s, he did a little sketch of it. This is the only record, therefore, of what they found, published on the back cover, I think, of the Leatherhead Proceedings. Now, the thing about room 6 is it's extraordinary jacketing with box flue tiles all the way around the whole room. And not only that, but they start in the wrong place. They're at the subfloor level. The actual floor of the room is up here somewhere, held up by these standard pili. So that's odd, quite definitely odd. And the only proper parallel I know to it is at Angmering in Sussex, where again you get complete jacketing of the room at the subfloor level. The floor's up here somewhere again. Incidentally, notice there was potentially a chalk floor there too, chalk trample, as said at the time. Now, both these sites have big base tiles for the hypercourse pili, and then big tiles to carry them up, a little smaller tiles to carry them up. That looks to be standard. I said this to Peter Worry at some point, that I was interested in this. Oh yes, of course it's engineering principle, but I'm not totally convinced, actually. Many of the illustrations, many photographs of bathhouses I've seen, they don't bother with a big base tile. This may be an early feature. It certainly features in the legionary baths at Exeter in the 60s. So who knows? Anyway, the key point here is these relief pattern tiles. Here's 1 or 2 of them. And the fact remains that they were stuck into the wall using fishtails luted to the back of the tiles. So there's one, there's its fishtail stuck on the back. Here's some examples of where the fishtail's fallen off again or broken off, because if you're trying to build on clay subsoil, it tends to move around, which doesn't help very much. And the walls shift a bit. So it didn't work. But as far as I can tell, no one has ever found this system anywhere else. This is experimental. The other experimental aspect is they had to cut a hole in the front of the tile to let the hot air get in. Most box tiles don't have that because they start above the floor level. So the hot air circulates underneath in the hypercourse, under the floor, and then goes up the boxes. So that's interesting. At Angmering, they did it a different way to fix the box tiles into the wall. they actually built ones that could be built into the wall with a waist that held them in position. But it's still doing the same sort of thing. How on earth do you fix it to the wall? The other thing that links Ashtead and Angmering that is interesting are these double box tiles. You have here Lowther's reconstruction of their use, which may or may not be correct. But in any case, that's what the tile looked like. And here at Eastbourne is an Angmering type tile in the sense of its decoration and so on. They're going to have been made somewhere probably local to that villa. And you can see it's almost exactly the same type. They're very unusual. So we've got two different aspects that tie Ashtead and Angmering together, and they're not that far apart down Stane Street, remember. So this is a time when they're experimenting. They're trying to work out how to make a bath system work. We tend to take Roman baths for granted, but you'll find that standard box tiles like this had still not been installed in some of the baths in Pompeii in AD 79, for example. They were making it up at this point, trying to work out how to do it. And we still don't really understand how it works at the top end. Not surprisingly, that end doesn't usually survive in a Roman baths. And they haven't taken some of the Pompeii examples to pieces, unfortunately. The other thing that's really interesting about the die-4 tiles at Ashtead that must have been built into the wall as it was first built in room 6, because you couldn't possibly build a flint wall and then go round hacking out bits to stick your silly little fishtail things in on the back of your box tiles. They built it as they went up. And they clearly built the whole thing at the time. The tiles must have been made at Ashtead because you couldn't transport things like that in any way that would be easy. And in any case, we're pretty sure that we can show that the tiles are made there. But if we move to the Rose Hill kiln in Reigate, we find that it's a 2-period kiln. It's very well built. So it is very likely to have stood for decades, for at least 2, maybe 3 decades. There's one phase of use, and then there's a second phase of use. And the first phase of use has these old box tiles, these box tiles, forming a drain under the center of the flue tunnel of the kiln and running a lot off from there as well. And some of those flue tiles carry the die-4 pattern that is at Ashtead, except that this time the roller is damaged. So their use here should be later than their use at Ashtead, which is pushing the Ashtead ones back to somewhere in the 60s, if not a bit earlier. And that actually squares very nicely with the research done by Sarah Machin and Mike Fulford, where they argue that relief patterning had more or less gone out of use by the 70s. And what we're looking at, there's die-4, there's a lot of other patterns very, very similar. Whoever did 5, whoever did 58, 78, they were thinking of this patterning, however they were created, whether by the same person or not. These are all very closely related, and they are strongly present in the Surrey and the area around Verulamium. So there's probably quite strong links there. Most of these patterns actually turn up at Verulamium. Here's a general distribution. They even reach Fishbourne. And we've got quite a strong case that the Fishbourne tiles were actually made at Reigate. So it's suggesting that Ashtead and Angmering were in the very beginnings of building bathhouses in Britain, and they were experimenting. And that idea for Angmering has been published by Lynn Lancaster, but our what am I doing? Sorry. Our site must also be part of that pattern, which makes Ashtead very interesting indeed. Right. it also points to the fact that tile production, because you can't transport that sort of thing, must have been in progress very early in the Roman period at Ashtead. So wherever it was, presumably out here rather than further back in the clay pit, it was going at least in the 60s, if not before. If we go to the 70s, then the picture changes again because this bathhouse almost certainly comes into existence then. The circular laconicum like that is likely to be dated to the 70s, which means that we can postulate that the baths at Ashtead, however they functioned, with the apses down here somewhere, and probably a freestanding or nearby or incorporated somehow laconicum, which is what this more or less has to have been, went out of use. What they did was they took out quite a lot of what was going on and they built them a new villa house there, with perhaps incorporating room 6 in this way. I warned you earlier on that a lot of this is speculative, but we do have to allow for 11 being early. And this area is a problem. It always looks funny. And although we couldn't find anything happening like that, I think it's quite likely it did. I'll show you again in a minute. I put the layout like this, giving these narrow corridors, because they're quite typical early on. And there's the Broad Street Villa, but that, of course, was dug early in the 19th century, so we can't make too much of that. But that pan would fit quite nicely like this. And we can guess at this narrow corridor because just about there in Trench 3, we could clearly see a line of some sort of feature running like that. So that's a postulation for that sort of site. The bathhouse is a nightmare. It was dug quite badly, and really it's quite difficult to be sure of what's going on. But one thing that is quite interesting is the way that line of wall coincides with that line slightly north of the well-known room B. And it's quite possible, and in fact, Steve Kosh thinks this for different reasons, that this was an addition, or at least the original went that way with no room here at all. But that, as I say, is just speculation again. We can assume a quite early activity on the site because of this rare flagon, which Paul Tyers thinks comes from Noyon and is to be dated 60s, perhaps to 90s, something like that. But it's really quite unusual, like many of the things from the site. And the other thing that's likely to be early is some of the lamp chimneys, at least, the most complete one. That's how complete it was, really. And you can, I'm not sure if you can actually see this in the British Museum, but in any case, that's where it is at the moment. But Lowther also found quite a lot of others. And there's the man himself repairing one from Verulamium. Also earlier, these so-called atrabatic bowls, which I still haven't been able to find, actually. Lowther must have been secreting them somewhere. I think he was doing research on them. There's some more. But one of the interesting things about this is that some, at least, of them were made probably at Ashtead itself. There is certainly good evidence for a pottery industry, and Louise Rayner has been happy to accept something we're now calling Ashtead local ware, which may also have produced this, which is about a foot tall, in fact, and I have still not been able to find a parallel for it in the Roman period. We've been to various conferences, we've shown the pictures to people, we've said, what do you think? And they said, really? So we are stuck. That may also, in fact, probably is a local product. If we move on to the 90s, we can start to see extra things happening on various sites. It's probably now, if not the earlier period, when they start to add to the proto-villa with a big wraparound portico here. Things happen in the main villa. Who knows what goes on at the separate bathhouse. One of the clues that may help is that we've seen a foundation urn over there. There's so-called burial urn, but Lowther sensibly put a question mark on it because it's not likely to be a burial urn. Found here, and even in some of the earlier notes, they suggest it's within the wall, so it may have been like the one on room 1. So probably at about this time, these rooms were added to the outside. I've suggested also that the wall here continued across. And one of the reasons for that is this gap specifically marked by Lowther on a very strange feature at the end of room 4 here, where there seems to have been a sort of bench or concrete bench of some kind running along that, but with that that gap as though they'd added to it, possibly when this happened, when they rebuilt the wall to do that. And Lowther, as you can see, himself thought that the solid flint work that is here appeared to be earlier in date than the flue heating system in the rest of the room. In short, there are 2 periods in room 4, which is likely. The wall itself, we felt had been rebuilt in some way. So if we could move on again, we've got yet another urn, which suggests that possibly this is the time when rooms 12 and 13 get added. And it may also be the time when we get a bigger front corridor with a porch. The wraparound effect here, this is Lowther's drawing, and he wouldn't have a wall there, at least he couldn't find one, but there was very little going on there that he could find, and it was the end of the dig. Whereas we do know that this wall existed. There it is. You can just see that the wall is slightly different in kind there, and there's a slight hint of it coming into this robber trench, and that would be where we found it, would be about here. So we can guess that something like this is going on, but obviously it is, again, speculation. The thing is that puts the porch in a logical position in the center. And if we use the sort of reconstructions I've tried earlier, where you're stopping at this point, you wouldn't have your porch in the center. So I think the porch is brought into life at this point. They may well have found earlier footings underneath it, but that's not so surprising if given that you're laying out the thing on the same alignment and so on. So anyway, that's the theory for those. Notice the segmental tiles found in this region. I'll come back to those in a minute, but I'll first suggest that one of the reasons for room 4 changing, or at least the occasion of it doing so, was that something went wrong in room 6. We know from our own excavation that there was a settlement crack here. Lowther actually records a settlement crack in that wall of room 4. And you'll notice here that the flue tiles around the sides are not present, and that's consistent in all of Lowther's plans, early plans or whatever. So something may have happened here. There may have been damage. The hypocourse may have collapsed a bit. The significant thing from our point of view is that here there are dog and stag flue tiles used as replacement pili. They're actually used to hold up the floor, packed with clay. So although sometimes people talk about them as though they were found in situ. They were found in situ in this room, but the chances that they were actually originally there must be low. At the same time, at least one dog and stag tile was used in this underfloor channel heating system. And there's at least one fragment from below the later floor in room 7. So we can tell fairly obviously that something is going on here where dog and stag tiles were being used in a way they were not intended to be used, probably because some of them were standing around spare on a stack somewhere in the site. There we are, there's the famous dog and stag. That incidentally remains unique. There are no other relief pattern tiles with animals on them. There's nothing like it that I've been able to find in the entire empire. So hooray for Ashtead. If we go on, I've forgotten why I put that. Oh no, sorry, I'll come back to the entrance now. With its segmental tiles. These also I can't parallel, incidentally. I can find tiles that look like these half tiles, these, but ones that have been deliberately made so that you can fix them into the wall. The wall runs along there behind. So they're nicely fixed into the wall. Then you put another one on top. Then you put more of these, and here they are from the site. I can't find an absolute parallel for that. But the idea where you do that sort of thing can be found in various places. That's Coimbra in Portugal, for example. But it's not a common thing. So again, an interesting Ashtead thing. And probably at this period, we have what amounts to a probable building inscription, which would be on the over the front door, as it were. And here are the bits that seem to survive. Some of them have gone missing from Lowther's house when stuff was taken out. But the principle of the thing is there. And these are actually quite difficult to parallel, this type of thing on a civilian site. They're not actually that common with this kind of cable moulding on military sites. You'll find them on places like Hadrian's Wall. And Martin Hennig and co, Penny Coombe was amongst them, thought that there was a hint of it being official or even military, having military associations, I should say. Oh yes, we go back to the bathhouse, the separate baths. This, as you can see, room B is much deeper than the circular laconicum and the heated room alongside it. And we found amongst Lowther's material this piece of samia, which says that it came from the foundation trench of the southeast wall of the separate bathhouse room B. So that ought to date at the earliest to the Hadrianic period. So it's later, probably, than the Laconicum. And it probably didn't last all that long because the idiots who made it didn't take account of the fact that if you dig a large square hole quite deep at Ashtead, it fills up with water. And they tried to do various things about that. They broke a hole through this end to drain it. They tried putting some chalk in around the pili and so on. None of it really worked, and I suspect it didn't last all that long. You can see the difference in height between where the pili in room A start and where they are in room B. The other thing that's interesting here is room A's pili have larger square tiles at the base. Room B's don't. Coming back to what I was suggesting earlier. Ernest Black once tried to do this sort of thing to the baths plan, which I think was ill-advised, because it's very difficult to make much sense of what's going on in terms of what was actually dug. But one of the things, and the main thing here is to note the actual late furnace here, which, sorry, I've done it again, which served here. I don't believe in the idea that this is replacing a previous furnace. We have no evidence for that previous furnace at all. And it's highly unlikely in my mind that if you had one in existence, you simply deliberately removed all trace of it so as to put a new one in slightly off kilter. There is this room in the planning seems to have been rather odd and may even have been at that alignment. I think that furnace was mostly serving a vanished bathhouse above it, which is now effectively in midair. What is interesting I think these came from Bird Oswald recently. I've already managed to forget that. It's worth noticing the furnace room, the flue beyond it, and these great iron bars which were used to hold up the heated tank, which we presumably had something like at Ashtead. And what we certainly had at Ashtead were these lines of wooden pipes delivering the water, because Lowther found these great rings which will have been used to hold the separate wooden sections together. What we don't know is the source of the water for the Ashtead baths. And there's not a lot to choose from. It's actually already quite close to the top of the hill. The other thing at this period is to start thinking about the tilery, because the tile kiln we found has two periods. And the first period is probably happening in this Hadrianic Antonine period. Building a thing like this, if we found it and didn't think it was a tile kiln, we'd be perfectly happy to accept that it was standing for centuries or a century or so. But people always get silly about tile kilns and the like and suggest that bits were taken off the top and so on. These things can last for a long time. The interesting thing about the Ashtead one is that because it was later built over, the whole thing was raised, it preserved features of the first period, including this tabular structure at the front end of the flue tunnel and the paving that almost certainly provided the route in to load the thing. And if we look at the front, here's those tegulae. You can see there, that's the original inner flue. And it's been built up above that to take a kiln above it. So preserving this, which is a temporary structure, David Rudling had part of such a thing at Hartfield. We've got the whole lot. And you can close this quite easily by putting a tegular across there as well. You can control the draft into your kiln in that way, once you've got the fire really, really going. You can also provide a through draft, as it were, to draw the heat right through the kiln by putting flues in the end wall, which almost certainly is what these are. They've used imbrices through the wall to do it. But if you look at our kiln from above, you can see that this, which is the back wall, is a temporary blocking. And that's the route in. You load this kiln through the back and you can go inside. There's a reasonable chance that this thing actually stood with a roof of some kind. So I think that's what's going on here. It's worth pointing out that the well-known site at Holt, Grimes puts covered wood store there, but why on earth would you put the wood at the back when you want it to shove him through the front? I think that's where they loaded and unloaded the kilns. The other thing we found was in Trench 23, a deep pit between the kiln we found and the villa, which had this remarkable plum pudding sort of mix in it, which is probably to be related to rakings out from the kiln and associated activity and chucked into this pit. And within the pit, near the bottom, was a face pot, which was rather nice. Come back to that later. So the final period in the 180s, thereabouts. I haven't in fact mentioned the earthwork, but there is a little bit of evidence that something was still going on at the earthwork, at least in the earlier period, at Roman periods, because there are bits of tile and pottery there. The proto-villa may not have gone on into this very late period because these sites show evidence for raising. This one didn't seem to at all. So here's the dating of the later period of the tile kiln. You can see what's going on here. This is the side flue. These are the flues to the earlier kiln that shouldn't be doing that. They should be wide open. So that's through us, or it threw me anyway, when people triumphantly showed me what was going on. And that's where we've got our jacked up kiln. We may be looking at a period when it got rather wet, and as it frequently does at Ashtead, and people decided that they'd do something about it by literally raising the site. Here, incidentally, are a brave band of people visiting the site in the 1920s. On one occasion, when Surrey Arksop was going to have a visit, the people, about half the visitors gave up halfway to the site because it was so horribly muddy. Which is worth keeping in mind when one wonders what was actually going on in the prehistoric period, for example. So this goes out of use in this late period. We have material from the furnace pit, which can be dated to the Antonine period, and therefore, if it came into existence in the Hadrianic Antonine period, that is room B, it had gone out of use really quite fast. And that makes sense to me because it must have been horrible to try to keep dry. We can also assume that the gutter around the villa, which is not a common feature in my experience, the gutter must mark the extent of the final phase of the building. And we have actually got a little bit of evidence to prove that it did come out that far from trench 28, and we certainly got it in trench 17 here. The other thing about this is the ditch. Although Lowther puts supposed line of pre-villa ditch, what evidence we have from the ditch, including from his own excavation, puts it considerably later. And as drawn, it effectively forms part of the gutter system, and would make some sense in doing so, because you've got to drain a bathhouse for a start. Whether that's the case or not, I don't know. There are other clues to what's going on late. This is room 2, and Lowther noticed that this wall had been butted up against the earlier wall here. And we've got a little bit of evidence that at least pushes the floor in this level quite low down, later than 100 to 145 at least. So Lowther's walls here, he thought were later, at least in one phase. So that's what we think might be going on. Here's the outer wall there, in trench 28. We couldn't get anything going on in this area, but we only really looked about there, and digging out that urn might have taken out any very shallow foundations like this. There's the gutter. The other end was here. That's trench 17. There's the ditch, seen from the air. Quite interesting, really. But it's difficult to be sure when it was first dug. We dug it at the back, about there, and none of the material from here was particularly early. Oh, that's just Nicky being Lowther at the end of the gutter. And here's the evidence from the ditch that Lowther recorded, but it includes things like, he claimed this was 1st century, it's actually 2nd. as with the Martius pot, and other things like that. One thing that is curious indeed is that a complete die-4 box tile was discarded in here. There's quite a lot of building material. This was a comprehensive rebuilding. And when we dug this area, it was full of wall plaster and so on. And the gutter wouldn't work unless some dumping of rubble and stuff had happened along here in the Roman period. Now, I promised to be good, David. Do you want me to stop at this point, or shall I carry on? Okay.
I think that with a fascinating heading that's on that slide, we have to carry on.
Okay. I'll try not to be too much longer. One of the things that I think is the key in considering what's going on here is the earthwork. We have very little gap in time between what's going on in the earthwork and what happens with the chalk floor building and the proto-villa and activity on the villa itself. And there is no good reason for supposing that the Roman military came in and said, right, we're taking over, because they shouldn't, in theory, have been allowed to do so. We have every reason for supposing that this is an area which welcomed the Romans to some extent, and certainly immediately said, jolly good, can we be friends? And it became part of a province under a client kingdom, rather, under presumably Togedubnus or a predecessor. And so if this was in any way associated, as one would assume, with a sort of upmarket late Iron Age bod, then it makes sense to assume that he then goes particularly Roman, welcoming all the new ideas, and indeed possibly fostering them by bringing in people to do the job for him. If you think of a sort of mini Fishbourne approach, if you like, this being someone who's really rather further down the pecking order. So I'm assuming that, but he is likely to have had military links. And the most logical thing there is to assume that this is someone who had somehow served in Gaul, had Gaulish links, quite possibly that if the GIS on the Die-6 tiles is anything to go by, a Gaius Julius, and so potentially dating back to the Caesarean period, at least, or at least after that. Whether any of that makes sense, I'm not sure at the moment, but it feels more likely than anything else. And this bod realized the potential of the site because you could establish a major pottery, tile industry here. Also, you'd have to be mad if you actually had the choice to put your villa on the site when you didn't have to walk all that far to get down into the much more pleasant area of where Ashtead village is, and not have to put up with great soggy clay and wet and so on half the time. So it seems most likely that we have a simple continuity here. But we do have a military connection. We've got the face part, Tatse, carrot amphora, straight road, wonderful gold earring. So these are upmarket things. We've talked about the decorated slab. I haven't mentioned, but there is a textile impression on a box tile, which John Peter Wilde says is the kind of upper quality fabric that he associates with the officer class in the Rome, up on Hadrian's Wall and the like. But by definition, if it's on a relief pattern tile, it has to be very early in the Roman period. And we've got a box tile, which I'll come back to in a bit. So there's our face part. That, incidentally, is a reconstruction. It actually looked like that. We've got one from Ewell, too, which is interesting. And we've got Gillian Braithwaite's study, which says that concludes that both face pots and tatsay seem to have been closely associated with the army and the military community in the western provinces. Well, we've got tatsay. We've also got a carrot amphora. Rather amusingly, a chap who surveyed these things said that the only villa, that was his term, in the country that had carrot amphorae was Fishbourne. Well, we've got one. Mind you, I think they may be more common than he realised. But Peacock and Williams say closely associated with early military sites in Britain and Germany. So we've got part of one of those. So it's a pointer. We've seen this thing. Here's what Hennig and Co. actually said. The visual language of empire doesn't mean the plaque was official, although the only owner might be a veteran from the army, civil servant. I didn't ask him to say things like that, so I'll take it. I suspect it was painted. This is green sand and not particularly easy to carve. And they painted it and put a painted inscription on it. You really have to assume something went there. Here's the box tile. Now, this is the dog and stag one. And Peter Worry points out that it's very unusual in having a hooked G. So it's Gaius, Julius, someone or other. And then IV fake it. So it's good standard stuff. Nice leaf stops like you find on inscriptions. And if you look at the legionary tile stamps in this country, or indeed inscriptions, it is very difficult to find a hooked G. And there are none on other legionary tile stamps here, except for Legio 20 Valeria Victrix. And here's some examples of the hook G on there. So there may be some sort of link with that legion, at least at the point when they were producing those tiles. Here's the tatsay, some nice pots too. We've met this flagon before. Unguentaria imply doing something quite posh with sort of decent oils and so on in your bathhouse. Various open lamps, but they're certainly lamps. Lots of glass bottles. John Shepherd says, significant part of the glass assemblage, used in the first instance for the transportation and storage of liquid comestibles, cosmetics, and pharmaceutical preparations. He even pins down some of the markings on the base to having possibly some sort of imperial estate connections. They drank a good Costière de Nîmes if they were lucky. Here's a Gauloise 4 from the site that came from Nîmes, presumably carrying that sort of wine. Lots of Samian, good quality stuff. Window glass from early on. Stuff implying writing. There's a stylus somewhere there. This is a Samian inkwell, of course, and that may have been used to seal correspondence. If it wasn't actually used to seal more useful things, more expensive things like coins and so on. That is a sad loss. We've not been able to find that. And a final marker of upmarketness in the Roman period is this, which has always fascinated me. It's actually, as you can see, like others, and research suggests that they are usually present on sites only as a one. And Janet Stevens has argued they were used in the elaborate female hairdressing systems and are not, as is commonly assumed, anything to do with needlework or anything of that kind. And she makes a very strong case for it. Right, I have actually managed to get through all that. How we explain a military link of some kind through the ages is difficult, but it's not that difficult to assume that an initial founder with military experience sent his sons off to join up and come back with useful contacts. And the Roman period shows us very strong contacts between military and civilian worlds in terms of the supply system. So it's certainly not impossible that something of the kind would go on. And I'm ending on this thing, which was a very speculative reconstruction based on the finding of a single bit of possibly Saxon pottery, although we may have found one or two more bits in our dig, which suggests some sort of activity on the site in the early Saxon period. More likely, I think they were simply looting bits for use elsewhere. But the site certainly was abandoned quite early in the 3rd century. There's very little in the way of coinage, which would normally be present in increasing quantity at that time. And none of the pottery really need go that late, or the glass or anything like that. So it pretty much obviously was abandoned probably around about 230-ish. And presumably the industry stopped at the same time.